Hello, everyone, and welcome to the pre-conference workshop with Peregrine Global Services. Today, I'm joined by Paul Mallette, Director of EMEA Operations at Peregrine Global Services, and Christina Perry, Project Portfolio Manager at Peregrine Global Services, who are about to present to us on achieving a robust learning outcomes process that encompasses key competencies. In a moment, I will hand over to Paul, but before I do, I'd just like to let you know that this session will have a few poll questions and a Q&A section at the end. So if you have any questions at all throughout the session, just type these into the question tab and we hope to answer all of these at the end of the session. For any unanswered questions, Paul and the team have kindly agreed to answer these following the session and they'll be in touch with you shortly. So without any further delay, I'll now pass over to Paul to begin the session.
Great, thank you, David. I appreciate you helping here, and I know Paul Thurston's online too to help us. Very competent friends of AMBA who have helped put together the start. I know that the conference starts today, and the forum rather starts today, and we're excited to be part of this forum, as we have each year in the last few years. This time around, we're doing it virtually, so we're looking forward to the time when we can actually see everybody together in one place. Let's move to just the introductions again. I'll actually pass it over to Christina. Let Christina tell you a little bit about what she does at Peregrine, and then I'll let you know a little bit what I do before moving ahead. Christina?
Okay, hi, my name is Christina Perry, and I am the Portfolio Manager at Peregrine Global. I am tasked with the development of new online services that aid in the evaluation of key learning outcomes and the development of student competencies. So that's what we've been working on this year, is development of a lot of new online learning modules and new assessment tools for measuring those learning outcomes.
Great, thanks, Christina. And Christina and I will be tag teaming on this presentation. So that you'll get to hear from both of us. Again, my name is Paul Mallette. I'm working in the European, Middle East, and African regions for Peregrine. I'm speaking to you from Paris, France. A little rainy here today, and Christina forgot to tell you she's actually in Wyoming. So we're spanning the globe here, and our friends in London. And I know that a lot of people in attendance are from all over the world. We have people here in Europe. I see some Asian partners online, as well as some people who are up early as well in South America. So thank you so much for joining us today. As David mentioned, there are several ways to participate, and we will have a couple of poll questions. When you have questions, please, you can type them into the question pane. There's a chat, there's a way to raise your hand. We'll be monitoring this, or Paul and David will be monitoring those questions and feeding them to us as we move ahead. And we do have some time at the end that we hope to be able to take questions if there are some. And as David mentioned, if we're not able to get to all of the questions, we certainly will respond to those once we receive them. As many of us are used to these presentations now, if we will mute your microphone unless the time comes where we can answer a question you might have, or if you've raised your hand, we'll unmute you. On your end, you have to do that as well so that we are able to communicate with you. So again, welcome to the presentation. And without further ado, let's get started so that we can cover all the ground that we have in the presentation. So if we look at the title, it really is looking at what we're doing in our institutions to improve quality, and quality through the notion of learning outcomes. We're in an accreditation forum, so we're addressing accreditation, and we're addressing the importance of quality assurance through accreditation. And AMBA is one of the leading accreditation organizations in the world, and has a set of standards which outline all of the things that institutions, the compliance they need to provide to manage the quality assurance processes in their institutions. And one of those things that is very much integral to the AMBA accreditation process is the development measurement and analysis of learning outcomes in your institution. As in many high quality accreditation agencies, it's very much part of the process. And AMBA takes to heart that the importance of learning outcomes, because it's embedded in many parts of their accreditation standards. And if we sort of look at the reasons why learning outcomes has become really important in higher education, AMBA deals specifically with higher education with regards to business, but this is applicable to virtually any higher education, as well as secondary and primary education. But in the higher education industry or environment, what we're looking at with regards to the importance of learning outcomes is the necessity to measure retained knowledge and to ensure that our students end their academic programs with retained knowledge, the process of learning in each of the modules they take, and at the end that they're able to walk away with a package of skills and competencies, knowledge that they can apply to their work environments. And that's retained knowledge, something that by the end of an academic program, we can be fairly assured that our graduates have the capacity to function operationally in a company or organization pretty quickly once they've completed their academic program. So AMBA places a certain importance and expects institutions to implement sort of a rigorous measurement process and sets of tools in which to better understand the degree to which students have retained that learning. So it's not just that you have to create a learning outcome, but you actually have to measure that learning outcome against what you do. So it's a very important part, and AMBA has put into place as part of their requirements this necessity to measure your learning outcomes. In addition, continuous improvement, as I've mentioned, to make the kinds of changes that are necessary in the educational programs that are partnering with AMBA to provide objective data on student learning. So continuous improvement comes through the process of ensuring that you're measuring, looking at those measurements that you've put in place, looking at the data that comes from those measurement tools, and making changes based on what you see needs to be changed. We see what we're doing well in an academic program, and we identify areas that are in need of improvement. And that's the continuous process. So programs are not supposed to be static. They're supposed to continue to change, continue to improve, and AMBA really expects schools to continually make those changes, as all international, national, and local accreditation agencies do. This is the notion of continuous improvement, as well as ensuring transparency, making sure that the stakeholders to your institution recognize that you have this engagement to student learning, that you need to be transparent in the process and accountable to your stakeholders, whether that be students or parents or employers, that the notion of continually improving your environment and staying engaged with that process, with that learning process, is important and something that institutions put into place to maintain that accountability. So as I mentioned, we work closely with all of the major accreditation agencies, including AMBA, to ensure that what we do as an organization of solutions-based assessments and modules is in close relationship to AMBA and what their requirements are. And if you look at the learning outcomes and goals, these are very much part, as I said, of the AMBA environment, which requires this direct assessment of what's happening in your program. And I will explain in a bit the difference between assessing simply your module or the class that's being delivered, and a programmatic assessment, which is what we'll be focusing on in our process today. So if we get into a little bit more detail about AMBA and what their expectations are, we notice that many of you who are familiar with the AMBA principles will recognize this right away, Principle 6, which deals with the competencies and the attributes that are expected of graduates. And it's pretty clear what's written here is the expectation of very articulated learning outcomes that can be measured and mapped to the individual course learning outcomes. So the outcomes should be broad enough to encompass the entire academic program that you have in place and to be in alignment with your mission. So that's why learning outcomes are particular to each institution. You have some guidelines, and I'll show you a few of the ones I've identified from AMBA, but generally your learning outcomes are going to reflect what your institution's goals and objectives are and its mission. So that's why each institution will develop its own set of learning outcomes to reflect its requirements and how it identifies itself in the marketplace. So if we look at the attributes that are outlined in by AMBA, what an MBA graduate is expected to have, there's no mystery here in this list that AMBA has put together, and I've highlighted a few that I think are worth mentioning. Things like leadership and critical thinking, decision making, maximizing resource allocation, strategic management, cross-cultural in understanding, ethics, being analytical, being able to analyze, and lifelong learning. So we see these attributes encompass a lot of these competencies, these workplace skills that are expected of graduates by the time they finish the program. They may not have all of them when they begin, but by the time they end an academic program, an MBA, an MSc program, or a postgraduate program in management, these are the types of things, the attributes that AMBA alumni are expected to carry on in and throughout their careers. Now, if we move ahead and look at the next principle, we dig a little bit deeper here, and I like kind of contrasting these two, because if you look at Principle 7, you'll notice that I've highlighted a number of different, what we would call general management or core business skills. And in this principle, AMBA clearly states that this relevant knowledge is expected of students who have completed their academic program, these major areas of knowledge, which underpin, rightly so, management. And again, I don't have the entire list here. On another slide I do, but I've pulled a few out that we'll all recognize: marketing, accounting, quantitative methods, management, MIS, organizational theory, OB, human resource management, general management, operations management, legal system. So you can see the list now looks at really these core competencies related to the functional areas of business, or what we sometimes call the core business skills. So if I go back a couple of slides, I'm looking at this. This looks like more soft skills, the areas of workplace competencies. These look more, and are rightly so, sort of the competencies related to technical skills. So we see a balance in what AMBA is presenting to us, is really making sure that our program covers both what we could call in today's lingo, soft and hard skills. So they nicely put together these principles which address both of these. So now I'm going to ask my friend Paul to bring up a poll question, because I have a poll that I'd like to ask. I think the poll question.
Yeah. So we've got the poll up, so we'll give it a few more moments for everyone to answer. and then I'll come back and give you the results in a moment.
So your poll question is just I think it's the same, pretty much, yes.
Yeah.
So because we had to fool around with a number of words on this. So my question is, does your MBA program have learning outcomes? So let's go back to learning outcomes for these core business subjects, this fundamentals of business. Does it have it for workplace soft skills? So I kind of put the 2 in there. Do you do it for both? Some for core business subjects and some for soft skills. So you have a combination of learning outcomes that address both of these, or that at the moment you really don't have in place the assessment process for your learning outcomes. Sometimes happens, that's not in place. You might have developed them. You're in the process of doing them. So let's see how you end up with that on your poll, Paul.
So we've had the results come in. So 15% have said business fundamentals, 0% say workplace soft skills, 85% say both, and 0% say we do not have in place learning outcomes.
Mm-hmm. So interesting that you see, that schools are doing the coverage of both. Some are not just doing one. That's important. So I think our friends I'm glad that it's anonymous. I think our friends at AMBA are delighted to hear that we are doing it as institutions. We are addressing these. And that's part of the accreditation process. That's part of the quality assurance process. And it's not an easy process to put in place. I've met with many schools in Europe and in the world, and this seems to be one of those areas which is high on the list of challenge and time consuming and data heavy. We're requiring a lot of energy and time to collect, analyze, and process this information so that it actually can be used in a way in an academic program that's useful. So my next slide is, well, how do you meet this requirement to create this process by which you're addressing the learning outcomes? So it's good that we have both. I'm curious to hear how schools are doing it. I have some examples of a process by which you can look at it in sort of a logical way. And generally, I like to call this the learning outcomes assessment process. And for those of you in our presentation today, it's no mystery that I'm using the Deming cycle of quality and improvement or quality assurance, which is used across the globe for many different industries, and we've adapted it nicely to continuous improvement for student learning. So there's no mystery here. We're borrowing from a very useful tool, the Deming cycle of continuous improvement. And in this illustration, you'll notice that the first thing that we want to make sure is identifying those learning outcomes, both on the hard and soft skills. So making sure that we have well-written, designed soft learning outcomes that include objectives. What is the percentage that we want to meet within each one of these learning outcomes? Because we do need something that's a bit quantifiable in order to provide AMBA with compliance. Are we meeting it? To what degree are we meeting it? And if we are not, where are we fixing it? So we have to have some objectives by which we're measuring, benchmarking ourselves. And then what is the tool, what's the assessment process that we're using to in fact collect the data? So we have this plan that we put together, looking at our objectives, looking at our learning outcomes, objectives, and then the type of assessment process or tools that we're using. The next thing, we put it into place. We actually measure, we collect the data and we analyze it. So we do the process of assessing these learning outcomes, and then we collect that data and analyze the data. Now, just doing that is of no use unless we actually study that and see where we're doing well and where we need to improve in order to mitigate our weaknesses So we have a nice set of nice data that gives us enough information by which we can make some changes. So we act on making changes in our academic programs based on the data that we've collected from our assessment tools that are linked, that are created to evaluate our learning outcomes that reflect our academic program. So the circle is complete. And what we do in this process is we measure a cohort. This isn't an individual student measurement. This is a cohort measurement. So we're measuring the cohort and we see if there are changes that are needed. It's unlikely that no changes are needed, because if no changes are needed, that means you're perfect, and no one's perfect. So institutions continually seek out places where they can make those changes and then reevaluate the next cohort to see if those changes have affected any kind of improvement from what you had seen as a deficit in the prior year or the prior group that you're measuring. So this is that process that I like to demonstrate to kind of keep us in sort of a logical way of looking at how to assess ourselves and use those measurements and that data for improvement. So if we look at this process, we're really directly measuring student learning. And generally what we want to try to do is measure that retained learning. So I go back to that introduction of retained learning, and we're trying to measure that retained learning. We're measuring it generally at the end of the program, which would be the time at which students have gone through most of their modules and have obviously built those competencies. So we want to see if they've retained those competencies by measuring them. And generally at the end of the program of study is when we measure them. So we obviously want to capture this with some expected results that we're hoping students will retain. So we've got some type of benchmark that we're doing. Now, you can do this as a standalone assessment. Many institutions do. I work with a lot of partner schools that implement our tools for measuring. And there are schools that embed them into their modules or classes, which is very data heavy and requires a lot of time on the part of faculty and administrators. And I know some of you in the room are using the embedded process, which is certainly viable, but very heavy in terms of administrative and data collection and an analysis. Now, obviously, this direct measurement is used for this continuous improvement process. So it's not something that is just collected and then put on a shelf or sent to AMBA to say, see, we're doing it. It's used, again, for that end of the cycle, that Deming cycle, to actually make some changes to our programs in order to provide students with higher quality in the following year, or improvements that may need to have been made. Now, one of the questions that often comes up is, why can't I just use final grades or marks at the end of an academic program? And at the end of a student's, take all of the students, look at their average grades, and then take the grade or mark from students in order to evaluate, say, a module in marketing. So let's take this as an example of a module in marketing, which is one of the fundamentals area in business. I'm sure you're all touching on marketing in your academic programs, and you have a typical module that has exams, group presentations, paper, and class participation, all with a percentage related to their final grade. So we have two examples, student 1 and student 2. And you'll notice in my example, both of the students end up with the same mark at the end, 81%, which you would say, yeah, it's pretty good. We're doing well. If I find that my cohort's averaging in the mid-80s, then I'm meeting that standard, that requirement, that learning outcome benchmark. But the problem is that that doesn't really measure learning. I'm measuring all kinds of things: participation, I have an exam, I have a paper, I have a presentation, and you'll notice that the scores these two students receive are very different on those different aspects of the class or module they're taking. Now, if I've decided to do embedded, and I'm saying, okay, it's going to be based on the paper because they have to do a paper on marketing strategy in order to determine if it's a viable marketing strategy. So here is your learning outcome, marketing strategy. You know, our students are able to identify strategies that are good or bad, however you put together your, you know, useful strategies, and say the paper is based on strategy. But the paper itself has a number of different rubrics, form, function, content, and even then, so the faculty person would have to be required to pull certain data out of that paper marking to fit into the learning outcomes. So it gets a little more complicated when you're embedding this, but also not appropriate to use just the final mark as a tool by which you measure retained learning. You have to have these marks. They have to be used in an academic program for each and every module. But for measuring learning outcomes and end of program programmatic assessment, using final marks from students really doesn't meet that requirement, doesn't really comply with the notion of what we're supposed to be collecting. So that brings us to the difference between course and program. So if you look at the difference between assessing a course, now I have to admit that I use a little bit of American jargon here as opposed to the traditional use of British usage. So when I'm using the word course here, I'm actually using I mean module. So I kind of go back and forth. Even after many years, I adapt sometimes better than others. So this is not an academic program versus program. It's a course or a module versus a program, an academic program. So if we're looking at this table, you'll notice that it's very different what we're actually doing and who's doing what. You'll notice that, for example, a course, everybody in a module has to be assessed. That's part of every faculty's requirement, is to assess every student. But for a program, you don't have to necessarily assess every single one of your students, but a good random sample of them, 25. Some schools do all of them for their program assessment, but it's not necessarily a requirement in every accreditor. In the assessor, obviously in module, it's the course instructor, the module instructor, where in a program assessment, it doesn't necessarily have to be the person it's generally not. It's independent of the instructor generally, if it's not an embedded. If it's an end of program and it's done in a different way, it can be in fact assessed by anyone. Obviously, if you're looking at the results, the course instructor, that's important for the course instructor to look at the results, where if it's a program assessment, it's really a group of faculty, a committee, the assessment group that's going to be looking at the program assessment to determine whether or not there needs to be changes to the program. So you can see that there are differences between these two, and sometimes there's confusion of course and program assessment. But program assessment, both need to be done. You can't forego course assessment, but program assessment is something that can be standalone, as I said, or integrated. So if we look at the creation of our learning outcomes, I generally like to introduce the Bloom's taxonomy. Most of you are familiar with this, and the tool that's very useful for creating them that we can actually measure with a quantifiable number is using the Bloom's taxonomy. And we go from, as you recall, sort of lower level skills or competencies to higher level skills and competencies. And we have these terms, adjectives that we can use to help write those learning outcomes in ways that are measurable. So instead of being vague, we actually use the right-hand side to write them. It's really not appropriate to use the word understanding when we're writing a learning outcome. And that the reason that we don't use a word like understanding is we can't measure understanding. But you can measure summarizing, or you can measure interpreting, or you can measure inferring. And if you look at the right-hand side, those adjectives allow us to create some kind of measurement. If it's on the left-hand side that's a little bit too vague, they might be good for general overall non-measured outcomes. But if we're getting down to measuring, which is what we have to do in order to determine if in fact our students are meeting our requirements, we really use that tool the Bloom's taxonomy to develop and write those learning outcomes. Now, I have a quick example here of learning outcomes by degree level. So I have actually 8 sort of categories, and you'll notice that I have a bachelor or undergraduate set of learning outcomes. I have a master's set of learning outcomes, and I have a doctoral set of learning outcomes. And it's really based on that Bloom's taxonomy, where I'm using obviously upper level competencies, higher level competencies as I move up in the degree level. So you'll notice that I've pulled some soft skills in each one of these, and I have number 4, the core business competencies that I'm expected students to have. Now, the challenge here is I've got this nice set of learning outcomes set up based on Bloom's taxonomy. Now I have to assess it, and I have to make sure that I have an objective, comprehensive, and measurable tool to assess it. And here lies one of the biggest challenges for institutions, is to come up with something that's efficient, economic, and effective in doing these things, being able to be objective, comprehensive, and measurable. So what I have here is a MBA learning outcomes plan with some objectives. So I have my 6 basic categories. These are my learning outcomes. You'll notice that I have an asterisk of the 10 disciplines outlined in AMBA's requirements. So I have those 10 included in my business core. In my MBA, I have my learning outcomes written in a way that I can actually measure them. So I have an objective that I want, in my first example, 80% of my graduates to achieve a score of 3.5 on a tool that I'm using. And I have a 360 evaluation critical thinking tool that's integrated. So I'm using that. So I have created my learning outcomes, keep them reasonable, never really more than 6, 7, 8, any more than that, and you're not achieving efficiency. You'll notice on my business core, I actually use a different tool. I have an end of program comprehensive assessment that I'm giving students that encompasses all of the disciplines. So students have to sit for an assessment at the end of the program. It's integrated into their capstone or strategic course at the end of the program. Leadership, another one in which I'm using 2 different tools to assess. So here I'm putting together an outcome assessment plan that provides me with something that I can use to measure and find, obviously, the objective is to find out where I'm doing well and where my students, or where, because I'm looking at myself, I'm not measuring just the students, I'm measuring what their retained knowledge, but it's going to provide me with information on what I might need to do in terms of that critical analysis to decide if I need to make some changes in the program to bring that, if I'm below my objectives, if I'm below my benchmark, that means I think I need to look at something to provide me with information. I need to look at what I need to do to improve. So the question then comes at, with measurement tools. So I have my next poll question. So I'll get Paul active again to bring up my next poll question.
So the poll was launched.
Okay, so here's our poll question, which is, do you objectively, and an important term here, objectively measure learning outcomes? So my first is yes, all learning outcomes are objectively measured. 2, second one is somewhat, most of them. And number 2, and the third one is no, that you're not really using an objective tool to measure, similar to what I just said. Okay, 80% are scoring this particular score on a programmatic, I'm not talking about course or module level, programmatic assessment of student learning. So those are the 3 options you have, kind of limited. I just wanted to see what we might get for responses.
So we'll just give it for a few more minutes for the rest of people to answer. Just before we give the results, just to remind everyone that we'll have a Q&A section at the end. So if you do have any questions, feel free to type them in. Hopefully we'll get to answer them at the end. So we've got the results. So 37% have said yes, all learning outcomes are objectively measured. We've got 54% say somewhat, most of our learning outcomes are measured. And we have 9% say no, we are currently not measuring learning outcomes.
So those are good numbers. I've done this poll a few times, and it looks like that we're on the right track. We're getting these outcomes measured. Now, I should have a couple of other polls. What are you doing with that? What kind of information? But that would be a longer presentation than our current one, which is long as it is. So it's encouraging to see that. And as I mentioned, looking at some different tools, looking at a process can help you move from somewhat to all. It can really help get you to the point to which you are actually measuring all of them. And I know that some people in the audience are rolling their eyes saying, well, I know, but there are certain things you just can't measure. And if you can't measure it, then it really shouldn't be in a learning outcome because it doesn't need to be measurable. So there are some questions here, and then there are some that are wondering, well, how do I measure certain things? And hopefully we have some people in the audience, as well as both Christina and I will give you some examples of maybe some options of how you might want to do that. So I'm going to move to the solution for learning outcomes. And obviously this is a sponsored workshop. Peregrine Global Services is an international organization providing solutions to schools of higher education across the globe. We work very closely with AMBA, so we tie a lot of our activities that we provide to what AMBA is requiring. So that's why I'm very much linked to what is happening with AMBA requirements, so that our services very much are in alignment with what is required of you as an institution. So we do provide a couple of tools that are very much in the vein of looking at how to create, to measure, develop, assess learning outcomes. And we have two very distinct tools for each side of those learning outcomes that you might have drawn up, the soft skills and hard skills. So we look at these two different types of skills that are addressed in learning outcomes and what you probably have in place, workplace skills and assessment of what we would call core competencies. So I'm going to cover first what Peregrine offers as far as its assessment tool for end of program competencies in the core skills of business, the fundamentals. And then Christina will help explain a bit of the evalual skills, and we'll take your questions. So let's start with global business. As I mentioned, this is a set of assessments that we provide, a group of assessments that we provide to help you measure programmatic learning outcomes on, usually at the end of a program. Sometimes once students have finished the fundamentals. This is the topical areas that we provide. So these are test banks in which you can select the number of different topics that might be in alignment with what you're teaching in your core business areas. You notice that I have 13 here, 12 are our test banks. The 13 is a customized test banks. I work with many schools that create their own customized bank, which means provide us with the questions. We implement it as part of a group of the end of program assessment. So it's integrated into our assessment test banks. They're specific to what you want to assess. If you have other topics outside of this that you want. So as I said, I work with schools that develop their own topics and subtopics. You'll notice there are 12 topics here. Schools can choose among those 12 topics. I have schools that use all 12, some that use 8, some that use 5, and then add customized topics if they want. Now, what's important to remember here is I said in my Deming cycle, I said you've got to be able to have data, and the data has to be good enough to be able to make decisions. Now, if I test students, for example, on business strategy, and I find that my cohort scores less than my benchmark. So instead of having 80%, I have 60% scoring, less than 70%. That was my benchmark, and I now have 60. I wanted it to be 80. Well, that's okay. So now I look at my courses in strategy, but there's a lot of material there. So it's important that you actually are able to dig deeper than just this basic topic. So what we provide is the ability to look deeper into each of these topics, and we call them subject areas. And for example, in each one, there are between 4 and 8 subject areas. So if I have that topic area of strategic management that I see I'm at 60, well, it might not be the entire topic. It might be one area within the topic, say strategic analysis. So students were really weak in the SWOT analysis and joint ventures. So that's useful information for me so that I can go back, look at my academic and program and say, well, where else can I address the SWOT analysis or joint ventures to bring up that knowledge so that the students retain that, because it's important. It's sort of baseline knowledge that students at the end of an business academic program, both on the undergraduate and graduate level, should have. And these test banks were written by subject area experts that looked at what the baseline knowledge would be for a student graduating in a postgraduate program in management or an undergraduate program in management. And they came up with each of these subject areas, which are generally found across the globe and what would be considered baseline knowledge. So these subject areas allows me as a program manager and as a group who is evaluating this to look more closely and then make more defined changes so that in evaluating the next cohort, I'm able to see if that adding a case study on the SWOT analysis or getting them to do more SWOT analysis or getting them to understand joint ventures more, I'm able to bring up that knowledge so that that next cohort I'm now up to 80% or 75% and it improved it. So this is what the objective of continuous improvement. It's like a production line for an automobile. Each stage of the way we assess whether or not the doors are working, and at the end we make sure that everything's working. So this works in the same way. So we have all of these topics, these 12 topics, and I've just put together a little mapping so that on the sort of the top columns are the requirements by EMEA, which are the hard skills, the marketing, the finance, the accounting, and then in the rows, we have our assessment tools, which allow institutions to say, okay, well, these are the ones that we want to assess. So I work with schools, or all the team at Peregrine works with schools to figure out which is the best combination to assess based on your learning outcomes. So I usually start way back in the learning outcomes and say, well, what are you developing? Have you developed it? If you hadn't, then let's work through developing the learning outcomes together. And I work with institutions to help develop them or refine them if they haven't yet, come up with something. So I work with institutions to help refine them and then look for ways for alignment, not only with what we provide, but also with what the institution does internally. So, obviously we have a service here that we encourage schools to use, but I work with schools on other kinds of things, our services, in addition to other tools that they might be using. So it's not just, I don't focus just on our service, but I try to look at it holistically when I work with a partner institutions. We call them partners rather than clients because we really do partner in the long run with clients, with schools, with partners to make sure that what we're providing is more than just the service, but an overview of how the process works. These are the features of it. Obviously, this is aligned with student learning. 12 of these topics is available. This is integrated into LMS systems very easily. It's provided on both undergraduate and postgraduate. One of the important things is we have a client service, client administration platform by which you can generate. We have about a dozen different types of reports. So you do not need us. We train, people who need to be trained. Very easy, user-friendly. Create these reports to allow you to do the data analysis. As I said, we can benchmark. You can benchmark your cohort scores to different what we call groups or aggregate groups, similar institutions that are similar to yours, so you can do some benchmarking. And we offer extensive security in these assessments. These are online, so you can do it invigilated or not, proctored or not. So there are schools that do sit students in front of computers. They take the test all at the same time. Others ask students to come in over a period of days, take the assessment, and some schools let students do it at home. We've passed over 1 million of these assessments, so we have a lot of experience in putting together a very secure platform that allows you to have enough security in the data that you get, that you feel confident enough that the students are doing the tests that they're supposed to do and providing the answers they're supposed to provide. We provide it in these different languages because we have international students across the globe. So I know people look at Mongolian, but we have a lot of Mongolian schools, so we've developed our language test bank in Mongolian, and we use the Global Business Education Assessment tool is what we call British usage. So we remove the US-centric language so that it's a little bit more comprehensible for people on the continent, as well as people in the Middle East who might be more used to, in Asia, might be more used to British usage of English, as they would call it the correct usage of English. And I know Paul and David would agree on that comment. So we offer, as I said, an online exam. Usually there are about 120 questions. Students usually do this at the end. We have a secure system in which one question at a time. Students can't backtrack. If they go off the page, a flag goes up. There's timed, so there's a lot of built-in security. We work with schools to say, how much time do you want per question? Do you want to give them a break? Usually there's a 48-hour window that they have to stop the exam, or I don't know, internet goes down, they pick it up where they stopped. So there's a lot of measures here that provide this nice secure platform. As I mentioned, there's a lot of reports here. I'm running out of time. I want to move a little quickly so that I give Christina a little bit of time to speak. We have a lot of reports, internal analysis reports, which allow you to compare topics and subjects. You can compare it externally to different, what we call aggregate pools. There are similar organizations to your own, schools to your own. Longitudinal reports over time. You can see how your different cohorts are doing over time, and we can break it down into topic and subject areas, and we give all kinds of charts. And these can be delivered directly to your accreditor, AMBA, to demonstrate whether or not you're meeting or not meeting, and if you're not, what are you doing to create a change in your academic program so that you improve on that benchmark that you didn't meet your objectives. As I mentioned, we provide an end of program completion certificate, which gives all this data to students. So it's a very nice, useful tool that students really like. They attach it to their CVs often. So a little bit of information on what we provide Peregrine on sort of looking at those fundamental skills in business, assessment test banks that are generally grouped with 10, 12 different topic areas, and usually putting students through that test towards the end of the program. So I'm now going to pass it on to my colleague, Christina, who is going to give you an introduction to the soft skills side of assessment and a tool that we use that's been developed for soft skills. So I'll leave it to Christina.
Thank you, Paul. You know, I learn something every time you speak. And one of the things that was going through my head, I really like the way you emphasize that the comprehensive exams, it really is using data as a flashlight, not a hammer. That's one of my favorite expressions in assessment. And the goal isn't to score wonderfully and everything. It's to really identify and then dig deeper into those areas for improvement. So yeah, I think that Peregrine's reports really do highlight that advantage. But let me just go ahead, and I'm going to take the second part of this presentation. I'm expecting this to be, 15 minutes or so, if you guys want to hang with me, and then if you have any questions. But before we get started, a bit of history for those of you who might not be as familiar with Peregrine. Before we launched ourselves into the world of academic assessment, Peregrine began as Peregrine Leadership Institute. And we provided industry leadership training, in-person workshops, one-on-one mentoring and coaching. And part of those that leadership training and development was self-awareness through a 360-degree evaluation. And that was our goal in developing a value skills, because Paul mentioned we have learning outcomes that are these traveling skills, they're these workplace skills. And how do we quantify something so intangible? Well, our idea was that you would get a measurement from a group of people for each individuals, rather than one assessor who might evaluate someone's public speaking or teamwork or leadership or critical thinking. You would get feedback from several people, multiple perspectives that would provide a more objective rating for that individual, so that they know where they can improve, and you can evaluate your program or your cohort as a whole to see where there might be gaps in achievement. Paul? Okay, there, thank you. And Paul had mentioned the accreditation focus with AMBA's Principle 6, and these are those attributes that your graduates should have upon leaving the program. So they're very specific here, that you're this is the type of person your graduates should be, and they should be able to demonstrate they're meeting learning outcomes in teamwork, in global citizenship, in business ethics. So that is one of the goals and ways that value skills would be used. Let's look here. For example, we talked about those Principle 6 outcomes that are expected. Evalue Skills has a menu of assessment items from which you can choose those that are most appropriate for your program. So if you wanted to base an instrument on those AMBA Principle 6 items, you could pull those out and create your own instrument. If you have learning outcomes that are specific to your program, and you want to create a new assessment item and develop a rubric for them, you could add that in as well. We did mention that you can customize our test banks, the same things for the Evalue Skills rubric. But basically, we want you to know that you can create your own. And here, I like the pizza analogy. When you go to a pizzeria, they have a lot of different pizzas on the menu, and you can choose one that you like, but if you think that's not exactly what I'm in the mood for, you can create your own. They have a list of ingredients. Same thing with the Evalue Skills instruments. If you have your own learning outcomes and you want to create your own pizza or instrument from them, you can add those soft skills to the instrument and then serve that up for all your evaluators. Okay, Paul, the next slide, please. Okay. As with our Peregrine's other services, we do have an administrative website where whoever is administering assessments for your institution can go in and manage the instrument. So this is particularly useful if you're doing perhaps different programs which might have different learning outcomes. You could create different instruments for each of them, but we have some specific ones that are already set up. You can choose that. You can run a report and see what exactly is being assessed in each of those instruments, and then make any adjustments that you need. The instrument report, this is something that's where you can check and see what all is being evaluated. So if I have an instrument that is based on the AMBA Principle 6 outcomes, and I want to see how do we define decision making? How do we define critical thinking? I can go ahead and run this, and I'll see for each of those soft skills, we'll see the ratings 1 through 5, from unsatisfactory up into excellent. And then you'll see some sample behaviors and statements for each of those criteria, so that each of the evaluators will have a very clear idea of what the scaling associated with each level of performance. And that really does speak to the objectivity of the assessment. And it's one of the difficulties really in assessing soft skills, is that Paul and I work together, and we might both be evaluated on certain soft skills. But what if our evaluators have different ideas of what competent or excellent or unsatisfactory are? Here in this case, if we're looking at critical thinking and problem solving is the skill being assessed, the evaluator is asked to choose a rating from 1 to 5. and it gives examples. So for an exceptional critical thinker, we're talking about someone who is naturally creative, able to work backwards and imagine steps that will get them there, views things from a variety of perspectives. So if that fits my recollection of working with this program, I would choose exceptional. If not, you know, I adjust down and find the level that fits. So from the administrator website, the person at the institution who has access to this can create various different instruments. They can track their progress over time. If they're administering the assessment to an entire cohort, perhaps at different stages of the program, if they're giving this to students entering a program and then they're reevaluating them after they've done internships or group projects or some other training or formation, they can generate before and after reports to see their progress. Now, for the evaluators, this is really the value of Evalu Skills is getting that wide variety of perspectives. You're not just having one assessor look at people and judge them, you're having several. So an administrator would set a minimum number of evaluators, say each participant needs 5 people to give feedback, and they must be at a variety of organizational levels. Perhaps some of them would be internship supervisors, some would be academic advisors, professors, peers they've worked with. And you can have the participants choose evaluators for themselves, or you can assign them to them, or you can do a combination of both. Now, we had mentioned being able to track and run reports over time. This is really nice if you're doing a longitudinal study for students who might be doing some sort of experiential learning where they're gaining knowledge in these soft skills and you want to test them before and after. It's also nice if you have different programs or different concentrations and you want to compare. How are my students that are focusing in accounting comparing to students who focus in marketing? Are their soft skills different? Are there, you know, are we focusing on different outcomes? So being able to measure and compare groups and see growth is one of the benefits. I'll briefly go over the participant role and the evaluator role. The administrator is the one who is going to set up the assessment, choose that instrument, and launch it to the participants. The participants might be a random sample of people in your program, or you might be doing this across the entire cohort, which would be best for professional development for those students. But each participant receives an email to go in and log in and create their profile. They will be able to run that instrument report and see what they're being evaluated on. They'll be able to do a self-assessment and really critically consider their own performance, and then compare that against how their evaluators rate them. So here's just a quick little snapshot of when the participant logs into the portal. They have the assessment they've been assigned to, when it was created. They can run their report once they get all their feedback, and then they can also see the instrument. They'll also have the option to generate an action plan once that assessment is complete. So the evaluator, this is the person who's asked to give feedback on the participant. And like I said, these are our peers who have worked with that participant, supervisors. If they're working professionals, they could also include subordinates that report to the person in the workplace, but really good to get a wide variety of feedback. The evaluator also gets an email to log in. They have a dashboard where they can see any pending evaluations. And then if they're asked, you know, Christina Perry has asked you to evaluate her on these skills, it'll bring up my picture and show them skill by skill, and they're allowed to rate me on each item and give written feedback for anything that they might think might help me develop those skills. So here, for example, this is an evaluator doing an assessment on their iPhone. This is available on their computer, on their laptop, on their tablet, on their phone. But they can scroll through and say, okay, on this skill does not play favorites. How does Christina perform? Have I noticed these behaviors from her? I select the most appropriate one, enter any written comments, and then go to the next one. And I can skip, come back to it, think about it, come back later. But I'll work my way through each of those and give full feedback. Then once I've finished the evaluation of that person, I can review it one more time, add any more comments, knowing that any feedback I provide is confidential. The participant will not know which evaluator attributed which ranking or provided which comments. They'll just get a list, and then I can submit it. And then if I want to come back later and I have other evaluations to complete, I can review ones I've done in the past to make sure that I'm being consistent in my ratings. So now we'll just transition. That was the participant and the evaluator's role. Now, once we've got that feedback, we want to look at that report. And I'll just go through the next few slides that show that we can have an individual participant report to show how that person scores. And then also we can see how the group performed. So here, this slide is showing my participant scores. And on this assessment, I had quite a few. It looks like I've had over a dozen skills that I'm evaluated on. And the green lines are my average evaluator score for each of those items. The blue line shows my mean rating across all items. So that's kind of my benchmark for me, is my blue line. Anything that falls to the right of there is something I've scored relatively well in. Those are my strengths. Anything to the left are areas of improvement. Unfortunately, in this example, it looks like business ethics is a weakness for me. And that would really cause me to have some self-reflection and see, what could I have done that caused people to question my business ethics? That's where I would come into my action plan. And in the action plan, it pulls aside all of my strengths and weaknesses and gives me a place to build and develop a plan and a timeline. So for each of those items here, one of my weaknesses is that I was not open-minded enough. What do I want to do to become more open-minded? What kind of timeline will I set for myself? And who's going to keep me accountable? Maybe I'll say to Paul, I want to report with you weekly or monthly, and I want you to keep me accountable for these steps. So that's something that will be available on the online portal and also in the participant report. Now, for the group report, this is where the administrator, now the participant will not have access to the group report. This is something the administrator would use to evaluate an entire cohort, for example. And in these reports, they'll see how their group performed as a whole on each of those skills. So this is that objective, direct measure of their learning outcomes. This is where they've gathered that feedback and on each of those learning outcomes, and they can see how evaluators are rating their students, how the students rate themselves. They can also see the frequency. That way they can see if their data is skewed, and they can see the distribution. So they see which students fall within that mean area for each skill, and then which students score significantly above or below the mean. And that can help them perhaps develop further training for students who might be needing it. Sorry, I'm talking pretty quickly here. I'll take my breath for a second. But for applications of this, if you're wondering how might this instrument be used, for undergraduate students, this is probably something you'd use at the end. For AMBA, this is probably less pertinent for undergraduate. Really where it comes into play is for graduate students. And we feel that one of the best practices is using a pre-test and post-test construct, where students entering an MBA program might get an incoming evaluation and then do it again at the end of their program. And that's a way that you can really track your improvement and show that you're making progress towards those Principle 6 learning outcomes. Another option would also be to use as a traditional 360-degree assessment for your faculty and staff to make sure that you are delivering on the mission, vision, and values of your organization. In conclusion, I'll wrap it up here and then I'll hand it back to my friend Paul. But what we've devised here is a way to get a measurement of those soft skills that form part of your learning outcomes, but that are harder to assess. It is very flexible and customizable in that you can choose the learning, the soft skills that apply to your learning outcomes. They have standardized rubrics that promote consistency and objectivity. There is a way to track your group's performance as a whole, and also to advance student development and professional development with the action plan that lets them focus on sustaining their strengths and mitigating weaknesses. And I guess at this point, that is we have been at this for about an hour now. So if you have any questions about the development of learning outcomes or about either of Peregrine's tools, I'll turn it back over to Paul.
Well, thanks a lot, Christina. We were dealing with some mic problem. My mic was having a little background noise, so sorry. That's why I was trying to communicate with my friends in EMEA, so some of those slides are a little off there. So, and yes, you did have a nice, you kept it going, so thanks. And we wanted to make sure that we had a little bit of time if there were some questions. I know having an hour and a half in a presentation is sometimes it can be sometimes long. So we'll take any questions. I'm not sure if there has been anyone who's raised a hand or would like to make a comment.
Yeah, so we've had a few questions come in. So I'll put forward the first question. So what would your advice be to business schools in terms of effectively assessing and measuring whether MBA learning outcomes remain current and are being achieved by graduates in the workplace once they leave the program? I don't know who would like to go first.
Well, it seems like the question's asking to ensure that your learning outcomes are current. If I understand the question correctly, Paul.
Yes.
It's, and I think this is a really good question, and I think Christina would agree that learning outcomes should change. They shouldn't be what you did, even 2 or 3 years ago. If you think about, the average life of a textbook, I know this drives students crazy, but the average life of, say, a marketing or even less maybe a harder skill finance, those textbooks the baseline knowledge is the same, but those textbooks last about 2 years to 3. So if you're looking at learning outcomes, the fields in which we are addressing the disciplines, so to speak, are moving. So it's moving all the time. Marketing is changing. I guarantee we will see a lot of new materials come in because of what we're addressing with online work, remote employees. We are already seeing a lot of that in the marketplace. So this is going to become part of the way in which we work in the future. This is not going to stop. This is going to be part of our new work culture. So learning outcomes do need to go through an evolution. And that's why the Deming cycle is important, to look at that and say, okay, these were our learning outcomes last year. Are they appropriate this year? Do we need to make a change? And I think it's important to take a look at the environment in which we're operating business schools. And that's where an organization like AMBA comes into play, because they offer forums like this one, accreditation workshops. They offer their global conference where they bring in lots of people from all different sectors, business and education, that tell us what's happening. They give us the information. And if we pay close attention to that, we'll recognize that there are certain areas that we as an institution, or you as an institution, I put myself because I worked many years on your side of the desk, making sure that my learning outcomes. Now, there are some that are going to stay in place, but I think that's important to address. And maybe, Christine, I don't know you, it seems that there are certain soft skills that have, sort of like are more popular in some environments and some institutions and some industries, which you need to sort of keep in mind that your soft skills need to address your particular environment as well.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that awareness of what professional organizations are looking for and those partnerships that business schools do with industry, it's that two-way communication where you're listening to your business leaders and saying, what do you need? And working towards those goals together.
So I think the answer, a long answer to a short question, is whatever you have as a team or a group of people who are looking at those learning outcomes, that is something to take into consideration on a regular basis and continuing to adjust those. And again, even if you're reaching your benchmarks, if your benchmarks are too easily reached, and this is one thing, I used to work for an accreditation agency, and I would look at a file, and it would show all of the learning outcomes being met. And that would raise a big red flag, meaning, well, either your benchmarks are too easy, or the objective is to find out where to make improvements. So I think it makes schools anxious to say, well, we haven't met them 100%. But I think accreditation agencies like AMBA embrace the notion of addressing and first identifying and then addressing where you can make improvements and continue improvements. So you don't raise the red flag by saying everything is perfect, because it isn't. And if you invite me into your institution, I will be happy to demonstrate a few places where we can all improve, and me included. So that's the important things, to really continue to evaluate that process, that Deming cycle, and use that as your sort of process tool.
Thank you, excellent. So we've got one or two questions coming in now, so I'll go to the next one. So the question is, how has the pandemic changed the evaluation outcomes?
Well, that's interesting. On the hard skills, our test banks, what we've noticed is a huge increase because we're a tech ed organization, education technology. And we've noticed, a lot of schools interested in being able to have secure and rigorous testing processes online. And there's no question. So we've been sought out by institutions and businesses and organizations, both on the soft skill. I mean, what Christina was showing you, we have the same thing in our leadership that's used specifically in the leadership environment and business environment. But this can, obviously, the soft skills can be used. But what we've noticed is, obviously an increase in demand, if you will. In terms of the outcomes, I don't think we have enough data yet to do research to see if, in fact, there's been any kind of change in the results of what we've noticed in terms of those two types of assessments, both soft and hard skills. Value skills is a relatively new tool that we've introduced actually this year, so we don't have enough background information even for this year to be accurate as a response. But there certainly is a higher demand for the services, and a very close look at what they involve. But as far as the results, our students scoring differently as a result of the pandemic, I'm not sure. I know that we're having a lot of requests because we offer a lot of online learning modules called Leading Edge Learning, and there's a lot of demand for helping schools move and fill, sort of curriculum gaps with modules. So that's a whole nother discussion. You can visit with me on Wednesday if you want to learn about Leading Edge Learning, which is curriculum enhancement through learning modules online. But today's discussion.
And I think that for the evaluation skills, what we're seeing is the selection of assessment items is reflecting some of what's being required during the pandemic, and that the focus shifts a bit more, the importance of adaptability and resiliency, and even emotional intelligence, and giving people a little bit more grace, I guess. In the past 6 months, people are at a breaking point in some areas, and we're learning how to work together and have a human connection despite the separation. So I would say it's affecting just the skills that we value, and we are seeing a lot more about this, dealing with uncertainty and ambiguity as a key skill.
Fantastic, thank you. So another question, can you explain further what type of staff or faculty assessments you do?
So that would be more, I think, on what is a possibility with the soft skills, and we don't really test our faculty members on whether they know marketing. We hope they do. So I'll leave that to Christina to address. So if we're assessing faculty, staff, or even in businesses using this tool, the 360 that we've developed.
Right, and that has, of course, less to do with learning outcomes, but organizations do have their own mission, vision, and values, and they have statements for, their employees. what we would do in that case would be to set up an instrument based on those values that you have for your organization, and then those could be distributed the same way as you would for a student cohort, but amongst faculty or staff, and getting feedback from their peers, from their superiors, maybe from teaching assistants who help them out, just getting that well-rounded perspective, and then identifying areas where your staff is excelling or areas where they might need further training and development. So that's something that Peregrine's been doing for over a decade in business and industry, and we find it equally valid for educational settings.
And to add to that, one of the things that the tool provides, the value skills provides, is obviously this kind of quantifiable, quantitative analysis with scores, but there's also the opportunity for the evaluator to write have comments about the person to whom they are evaluating. So that's a really important component, obviously within the student environment, but also within a staff or administrator or faculty environment, where you can write a narrative of explaining observed skills or areas, that it's not just hard numbers, that you have an opportunity to, and that's available to read on the part of if it was a supervisor or a program director and wanted to find out what kind of comments were being made. So that comment section means that you can have a qualitative response as well, which I think is very important. I worked recently with a school, and for them it was really important to make sure that there was a component by which someone could write in a comment, so that it wasn't just a number checked off on a Likert scale, but also the ability to make a comment, because those are that enriches the evaluation significantly.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I'm thinking about if you're assessing a skill like conflict resolution, something like that. Having a number is less useful than saying, there have been instances this year in which this happened and the person responded this way, and I would have liked to have seen something else, and giving that guidance. So yeah, absolutely.
Fantastic. So another question. How would you involve employers or external companies to shape the learning outcomes?
That's a good question, and I think what I have seen happen with the development of learning outcomes is many institutions will have an advisory committee, advisory board, corporate advisory board. There's all kinds of names. It's not your internal academic committee. It's really people, and it could be a mix. It can be a faculty and outside businesses that come in on an annual, biannual basis to learn about what the school's doing. Many schools do this. This is a requirement by many accreditors, that you have to have an advisory committee where you bring in working professionals who will look at your programs and look at the kinds of things that you're doing. The ways you can fit them into that process is introduce them to your learning outcomes, to say, these are what our expectations are for our graduates. This is what we want them to walk away with. This is the tools that they're going to walk away with. Maybe not 100% every specific tool, but introducing them and getting feedback, because the external environment, the businesses that are hiring your students have expectations of their knowledge as well. Now, the problem is sometimes they're very focused on their particular industry and their company. So there has to be sort of a balance by which you address what they think is interesting in a more global way, rather than specifically, we want someone to know this when they come into my company. And that's the challenge. It has to be broad enough that it can encompass, many companies, but bringing those people in, and if they have experience in looking at programs, and keeping in mind when you're asking for feedback that it has to sort of be in alignment with what distinguishes your business school from others. So that vision of, as Christine would say, who you are, what your raison d'être is, if they keep that in mind when looking at your learning outcomes, then you help them along the way. to give you some feedback saying, yes, we think these are important, or you put them as a list and say, rank them to highest to lowest, to what you think. Where do you, give them some exposure to that process. And if you have experienced people that, you can bring in to actual writing those, then that's a good thing. But I think providing some feedback, letting them see what those learning outcomes are. I don't think learning outcomes should be something hidden and kept from from the public. In fact, there are accreditation agencies that expect you to list what your learning outcomes are and what your results are. That's not EMBA's case, but there are some that do that. So keep in mind that it's important to involve them if you can, and grade if you can, but you be careful that it's not so tunnel visioned into one particular industry or in one particular type of business.
Yeah, and Paul, if I might add too, in addition to the advisory boards, which are obviously excellent sources of information, if a school doesn't have that, there are annual reports for like the Society of Human Resource Management, other organizations, the National Association of Colleges and Employers, that do studies across industry. So it's a broader perspective, but they might have, particularly for soft skill learning outcomes, the greatest deficiencies or areas where human resource professionals are looking for improvement in graduates. So that can guide some of that academic decision making as well, just staying current on industry standards.
Industry standards, and as you're right, it's not just an advisory board, but if you have visiting faculty, for example, who are working professionals, and you can pick their brain, so to speak, that's a good thing, because if they're teaching subject areas, disciplines, they are sort of the experts in that area, so they can help guide some of those learning outcomes. So you have resources within. Some desktop work that Christina talked about in terms of finding what's happening in the trade journals and industry. So I think there are some solutions out there.
Amazing, thank you. So another question, are we collectively as a business school community measuring the right things in terms of learning outcomes?
As a community, globally, in my experience, I think we're getting there. I think that it's a really good question because there's a lot of ways in which business schools operate based on historical ways of operating, historical disciplines that are being taught, historical ways of separating courses and modules. And what's happened actually because of COVID is there's a lot more innovation in ways in which teaching and learning is taking place. So I think that there's some movement there, but I do think, I'm not, I just see what dozens of different schools have created. My challenge when I look at learning outcomes is to provide something that's distinguishing to the institution, but still covers what's expected. If you have a diploma that says MBA on it, there are certain expectations that come with that type of diploma. It's like if I have a medical degree, there are certain expectations, and if I have a law degree, there are certain expectations of what I know. If I have an MBA, there are certain expectations of what I know. And I do think we have an obligation to cover those expectations, because if you have business in your title of the diploma, there are certain components to business, including finance, marketing, accounting, and the soft skills that are expected. If you're teaching a business program, and I was once with a director, and they were trying to put together an undergraduate program, and they said, well, our students really don't like, finance, so we're not going to put it in our BBA, Bachelor's of Business Administration. I said, well, it's not a student decision. Students need to learn that. Well, it's not whether they like it or not. So again, some of it is what's the expectation in the marketplace of that type of diploma. Maybe there's another type of diploma that addresses other kinds of things, but an MBA is a generalist diploma, and it is designed to provide baseline knowledge in a lot of functional areas. So I do think that there's a lot of challenges, and I'm not sure I have a perfect answer to that. I don't know if Christina wants to add anything, if we're doing everything right with what we're expecting, you know,
Well,
learning
haven't
outcomes to.
expectations been shifting too? I mean, that's really the thing. And particularly this year in the United States, social justice, diversity and inclusion, bridging inequalities, things like that. And that does correspond to some of AMBA's guiding principles as well, the cultural effectiveness. And so I think that it really does focus on your mission of covering what's expected of an MBA, but also continually improving and adjusting to these shifting paradigms.
Amazing, thank you. I think we've got time for one more question. So don't worry, any of the questions which have come in, we'll pass them over to Paul and Christina to get in touch. So the last question is, how do business schools strike the balance between hard skills, strategy, management, business knowledge, with soft skills, stress management, resilience, emotional intelligence in terms of developing rounded business leaders of tomorrow?
Strike the balance.
That's a fantastic question, isn't it?
I know, because I have to think before. Again, I go back to what's the objective? Why do you exist as a business school? What's the reason that you operate? What do you want to provide as an institution? What are your goals and objectives, which will then define that balance? There are some schools, I think of my hometown, Boston, and there are two schools which have pretty well-known MBA programs, MIT and Harvard. Well, they're in Cambridge, but Harvard is in both places. And if you look at those two institutions, they have MBA programs, and one is really focused on the technology side, the engineering side of what MBAs would graduate with, and what their raison d'être, why they exist. And if you walk down, past Kendall Square down to Harvard Square, and you go on to Harvard Business, we have to go across the river to Charles River to go to Harvard Business School. Their business programs are taught using exclusive case study methods, which really draw on significant soft skills development. Hard skills are expected, but really that interactive process that takes place in the classroom. And I was lucky, I did some evening programs and saw both faculty, and it's interesting how they approached it. But if you just take that as an example, think about the importance of who you are, what you're doing, what you want to do, and that's going to give you is it more on this side of the soft skills, or a little bit more on the technical skills? I think that would be when you asked that, I had to think about how I would address it, and that's probably the best example I could give.
Good answer, Paul.
Excellent, thank you. So unfortunately, that seems to be all the time we have for today. There's been lots of questions coming, so what I'll do is I'll pass them over to you guys afterwards, so you can get in touch with the delegates. Just before we close the session, I'd just like to let everyone know that tomorrow, the first session of the Accreditation Forum will take place, and that will be at 10 a.m. BST with Mark Stoddard, and he'll be presenting on understanding the accreditation process. So everyone is registered onto this session, so you will receive emails an hour before the session. Obviously, also today you would have received an email. So exactly like this session, click the link and it will guide you through to the session where we'll join. Like to thank again Peregrine Global Services for being the supporter of the event and sponsoring, for Paul and Christina for taking the time out to present today, and we look forward to seeing everyone on the session for this week.
Great, thanks, Paul, and I'm just going to say thank you, and here's a couple email addresses. I dropped the .com off of our email addresses, but you can contact Christina, myself, or directly Peregrine. I have a telephone number here in France if you want to contact me here, or you can contact our main office. And I'll let my friend Christina say a few last words as well.
Well, just thank you all for joining us today and for being a part of this. And I do look forward to hearing from you. Send me an email if you have any questions about particular services. Paul's a wealth of information about developing learning outcomes. So we hope to hear from you.
Yeah, and we look forward to seeing you someday.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.